Before we get into the ranking itself, a few quick notes on how we built this list. It blends two things: the raw data, meaning IMDb scores, Rotten Tomatoes ratings, and viewership numbers, and fan reception, meaning how the Walking Dead community actually responded to these episodes at the time they aired, and how that conversation has evolved in the years since. Neither metric alone tells the full story. A finale can score brilliantly with critics and still feel like a letdown to the people who had been watching for 5 years. And a finale can draw enormous viewership while doing real damage to the show's long-term health. We are weighing all of it, which is why the ranking you will hear tonight may differ from a straight IMDb list or a straight viewership chart. There are 11 finales in total. We are ranking 10 of them. Before the countdown begins, we need to talk about the one that did not make the list. Season 6, Episode 16. Last Day on Earth. April 3rd, 2016. This is the Negan finale, the cliffhanger finale. And it is the only Walking Dead season closer that we are setting aside, because it genuinely does not function as a finale in any conventional sense. It is an interruption dressed up as an ending. The 90-minute episode spends its first 75 minutes watching Rick's group try to move a critically ill Maggie to the Hilltop Doctor, only to be turned back at one saviour roadblock after another. The same visual pattern, a wider and wider saviour presence, repeated across the episode as a piece of escalating dread that many critics found effective and many viewers found exhausting. Then the final 15 minutes deliver Negan's monologue, his selection of a victim from Rick's kneeling group through the eeny, meeny, miny, mo sequence, and the first-person POV shot as Lucille swings down, blood hitting the camera. Cut to black. No resolution. The backlash was swift and specific. Jeffrey Dean Morgan's performance was praised almost universally. His Negan was everything the comic fans had hoped for. But the choice to withhold the victim's identity until Season 7 felt to many people like a contract violation. This moment, the murder of a beloved character, had been in the comics since issue 100. Fans who had followed the source material had been waiting years for the show to reach it. To get to the moment and then literally cut away from it was experienced as a cynical delay of earned catharsis. The AV Club gave the episode their lowest Walking Dead grade ever. Slate called it a ratings grab. Andrew Lincoln said afterward that he woke up in the middle of the night unable to sleep because he was so angry about how it ended. Robert Kirkman later acknowledged the response was much bigger than the creative team anticipated. It drew 14.19 million viewers for the finale itself. The Season 7 premiere drew 17.03 million curiosity-driven viewers who needed to know who had been killed. And then the show lost 4 million viewers by mid-season and never recovered. Many analysts who have written about the show's decline identify this cliffhanger as the single inflection point where the audience's trust broke and stayed broken. We acknowledge it, we set it aside, and we begin the ranking. Number 10. Welcome to the Tombs. Season 3, Episode 16. March 31st, 2013. Season 3 is one of the most fondly remembered stretches of this show. The Governor, played by David Morrissey, became the first truly compelling human villain the series had produced. Woodbury felt like a real place with a real internal logic, a community that had chosen safety over ethics and was slowly discovering what that trade-off actually cost. The prison gave Rick's group something they had been searching for since the farm burned, a defensible home that felt like the beginning of something, rather than just another stop on the road. The conflict between those two worlds built steadily across 16 episodes into something that genuinely deserved a spectacular payoff. Welcome to the Tombs delivered something more complicated than that. It aired on March 31st, 2013, drawing 12.42 million viewers. That was a record for the show at the time. The audience was absolutely present for this episode, in the largest numbers the show had ever seen for a season closer. The episode begins with the governor beating Milton nearly to death for burning the Walker pit. He locks Milton in a room with a restrained Andrea, leaves them together, and tells Milton that he will reanimate and finish her off for him. It is a cruelly efficient setup. Andrea spends the episode trying to free herself from her restraints with a pair of pliers that the dying Milton has dropped near her hand. The tension of that sequence is real and well executed. She almost makes it. Her fingers almost reach the door handle. And then Milton bites her. Andrea's death, shooting herself off screen while Michonne stays with her, became the finale's most contentious moment and remains genuinely divisive over a decade later. What made it harder to accept at the time, and what has made it harder to defend in retrospect, was the information that emerged afterward. Actress Laurie Holden spoke publicly about it on multiple occasions. Andrea was never supposed to die in this episode. The original plan had her surviving to lead the Woodbury refugees and take on a more active leadership role in season 4. Showrunner Glenn Mazzara changed the decision just 3 weeks before filming began. 3 different script versions reportedly existed for the finale's conclusion. The version that aired was partially rewritten by incoming showrunner Scott Gimple 2 months after initial production had wrapped, which is an unusual production circumstance even by the standards of a show that had already had one showrunner departure. Holden stated plainly that many of the writers opposed the decision and that the death was executed for shock value rather than narrative necessity. When you watch Andrea's final scenes knowing all of that, the seams are visible. The death does not feel earned by the story, it feels like a decision made outside the story. The governor's own arc in this episode frustrates for different reasons. He leads the assault on the prison. Rick's group repels them with flash grenades and carefully planned ambushes through the corridors that give the episode its title. The Woodbury army retreats, and then the governor stops the convoy and massacres his own people. Roughly 20 Woodbury soldiers gunned down in a field by their own leader when they refuse to turn back and attack again. It is a genuinely shocking scene that reveals something important about how far gone he actually is. And then he drives away. The season ends without any resolution to his story. He will return in season 4 for 2 memorable episodes, but for viewers watching this episode as a season conclusion, it is an open wound masquerading as an ending. The show's central human villain does not face consequences in the episode that was supposed to close his arc. The one moment that earned near universal praise was Carl shooting a surrendering Woodbury teenager. It is uncomfortable and deliberate, and exactly right. That scene is the first clear evidence of who Carl Grimes is slowly becoming, and it plants a seed that the show would carefully tend across 3 more seasons. Welcome to the Tombs earned an 8.2 on IMDb. Glenn Mazzara departed as showrunner shortly after. It sits at number 10 not because it is bad television, but because the season it was closing deserved a more complete resolution than it received. Number 9. Wrath. Season 8, Episode 16. April 15th, 2018. All-Out War ran across the entirety of Season 7 and 8. That is roughly 32 episodes of television, nearly 2 full years of storytelling, built around a single central conflict. Rick's alliance versus Negan's saviours. The story had real elements working in its favour. Jeffrey Dean Morgan's Negan was a genuinely original villain for this genre. The introduction of the kingdom, the hilltop, and the broader world of communities fighting for survival expanded the show's geography in ways that felt long overdue. And the all-out war storyline from the comics is well regarded by fans of the source material. The execution across 16 episodes of Season 8 tested the audience's patience in ways that the source material had not prepared them for. The pacing was slow. The structure leaned heavily on parallel editing between storylines that did not always feel equally urgent. And the mid-season death of Carl Grimes, while genuinely affecting, removed the character whose arc across the entire series had been building toward the resolution this war was supposed to provide. By the time Wrath aired on April 15th, 2018, the audience was ready for it to be over in the most fundamental sense. It drew 7.92 million viewers, roughly half what the show had been pulling at its peak. The episode's single best moment belongs to Eugene Porter. Across Season 8, Eugene had defected to the Saviors and was manufacturing ammunition in the Sanctuary, collaborating with Negan in ways that genuinely alienated portions of the fan base who had been rooting for him since his Season 4 introduction. The question of whether Eugene was actually betraying his friends or playing a longer game sat unresolved for the entire season. Wrath answers it. Eugene had been secretly sabotaging the ammunition. Every casing produced in the Sanctuary's bullet-making operation had a flaw built into it. When the Saviors opened fire on Rick's advancing forces at the episode's climax, every single gun backfires, weapons jam, barrels rupture, the entire firing line collapses. It is the twist the season needed, and it arrives with a genuinely satisfying clarity. Josh McDermott's Eugene has been one of the show's more deliberately opaque characters for years, and the reveal that his survival instincts had been quietly channeled toward protecting his friends rather than replacing them earns its moment. What follows is where the episode divided its audience. Rick pursues Negan across an open field to a hillside where a single tree stands in morning light, its branches full of stained glass that Siddiq and others had hung there. Rick asks Negan to consider the future that Carl had imagined. Then he slices Negan's throat with a shard of glass. And then, while Negan lies bleeding, Rick orders Siddiq to save him. Negan will survive. He will be imprisoned rather than executed. Rick is choosing mercy. Carl had written about it in his final letters. This is Rick honouring his son. The decision genuinely split the fan base, and the split had nothing unreasonable on either side. After 2 full seasons spent watching Negan murder Glenn and Abraham, subject Daryl to extended psychological torture, and systematically dismantle everything Rick's group had built, many viewers had earned the right to want catharsis. Some of them had been watching the show for 8 years, and a significant portion of those 8 years had been building toward this exact confrontation. Stepping back from the kill felt to a large number of people like the show choosing an interesting theme over an emotionally satisfying resolution. At the same time, the decision is the most thematically coherent moment the season produced. It connects directly to Carl's arc. It sets up an interesting and genuinely complex story about what you do with a man like Negan when the war is over. And Rick choosing not to kill Negan, when he had every justification to do so, is a more interesting character beat than the straightforward revenge the season had seemed to promise. A brief post-credits scene showed Maggie conspiring with Jesus and Daryl to eventually undermine Rick's decision. It gestured toward a conflict between survivors who had different relationships to what Negan had done to them. That conflict took 3 seasons to partially resolve. Wrath earned a 7.7 on IMDb and a 75% on Rotten Tomatoes. Scott Gimple's final episode as showrunner. The Chicago Tribune found it surprisingly emotionally resonant, despite the season that preceded it. At number 9, it is a finale that does several things well, while carrying the weight of a season that tested its audience more than was strictly necessary. Number 8. Rest in Peace. Season 11, Episode 24. November 20th, 2022. The series finale. Episode 177 of The Walking Dead, airing on November 20th, 2022. 12 years after that Halloween premiere. It drew 2.27 million same-day viewers and climbed to just over 3 million with delayed viewing. It was the most watched episode in AMC Plus streaming history at the time of its release, which tells you something specific about how the audience for this show had changed in the years between Conquer and here. The viewers had not disappeared entirely. They had migrated to different platforms and different viewing habits. The honest truth about Rest in Peace is that it is two separate episodes playing simultaneously, trying to be both a genuine farewell to characters the audience had spent over a decade caring about, and a franchise advertisement for 3 spin-offs that had already been announced. It largely succeeds at the first thing. The second thing is visible in a way that some critics found impossible to overlook. The episode's emotional centre belongs to Rosita Espinosa. She is bitten while rescuing children from a walker attack, and the episode takes genuine time with her final hours. There is a scene in a garden where she sits with Eugene, and it is quiet and specific and real in the way that the show's best character scenes always were. Christian Serratos gives a performance that earns the grief of the people watching. She says goodbye to her daughter. She finds a moment of actual peace, which is a hard thing to write for a character in this genre, without it feeling false, and the episode earns it. Rosita's death is the best thing in Rest in Peace, not because death is better than survival, but because the writing and performance take it seriously, rather than using it as a narrative convenience. Negan's arc finds its conclusion in this episode as well. He finds Maggie alone, and offers an apology. Not a justification, not an explanation. A real apology, from Glenn Rhee's killer to Glenn Rhee's widow, at the end of 11 seasons of carefully managed distance between them. Lauren Cohan and Jeffrey D. Morgan have both spoken about what filming that scene meant to them. It works because the show had spent 2 full seasons building toward this exact beat rather than trying to shortcut it. And then come the final minutes. Daryl rides off on his motorcycle toward France, which is the setup for his spin-off series. A scene reveals that Rick Grimes has been alive all along, in CRM uniform near Philadelphia, which sets up The Ones Who Live. Michonne rides in armour through a massive walker herd, same spin-off. These sequences were written by Scott Gimple, not the main Season 11 writing team, and they were filmed separately in August 2022, months after the rest of the episode had wrapped production. That origin story is faintly but undeniably visible in the footage. The Rick and Michonne scenes do not feel like they belong to the same episode as Rosita's death. They feel like they were stitched in because they were. Collider gave the episode a C- and specifically called the spin-off sequences cynical franchise maintenance. The Rotten Tomatoes score split neatly along audience and critic lines, with critics at 67% and audiences at 90%. That gap tells you something real. Long-time fans found the character work genuinely moving. Critics, evaluating the episode as a piece of television craft rather than as a decade-long emotional experience, found the structural compromise difficult to set aside. Bear McCreary recorded a live orchestra score for this episode, which gives it a texture that the later seasons often lacked. Voiceovers from Glenn, Abraham and Carl are woven through the final act. Chandler Riggs appears briefly as a background farmer at the hilltop, an acknowledgement so quiet that viewers who missed it went back to find it. These details reflect genuine care for what the show was and what it meant to the people who made it. Rest in Peace is a finale that earned its emotional moments and then spent them on franchise obligations. It sits at number 8 because the farewell it was trying to give was real and deserved, and the farewell AMC needed it to perform was always going to be in tension with that aim. Number 7. The First Day of the Rest of Your Life. Season 7, Episode 16. April 2nd, 2017. Season 7 was The Walking Dead at its most deliberately oppressive. The premiere, which finally revealed that Negan had killed Abraham and Glenn, drew 17 million viewers and was immediately controversial for the sustained nature of its violence. What followed was 16 episodes structured almost entirely around Rick's subjugation by the Saviors, Rick carrying tribute to the sanctuary, Rick on his knees, Rick choosing compliance over and over again, while the audience waited for something to turn. There is a real argument that Season 7 understood something true about power and submission, and the psychological damage that prolonged defeat inflicts on people. There is an equally real argument that it was a difficult and often joyless season of television that asked its audience to sit in its characters' worst moments for too long. Both things can be true simultaneously. The First Day of the Rest of Your Life aired on April 2nd, 2017, and drew 11.31 million viewers. That was a 20% drop from the Season 6 finale. The audience that had been promised a resolution to the cliffhanger had watched the resolution and then started leaving. The episode's most creative sequence belongs to Sasha Williams. She has been captured by Negan and is being transported to Alexandria in a coffin as a psychological weapon against Rick. She uses the hours in that coffin to make the most deliberate choice any character makes in this finale. Eugene had smuggled a single suicide pill to her in an earlier episode, and Sasha takes it, dying and reanimating inside the coffin, so that when Negan opens the lid, expecting to use her as leverage, she lunges out as a walker and attacks him instead. The episode intercuts Sasha's final hours with memories of Bob and Abraham, the people she loved and lost. She listens to Donny Hathaway's "Someday We'll All Be Free" on headphones in the dark. Sonequa Martin Green understood that her character was being given a significant exit, and she played every scene in this episode with a quietness that made the sacrifice feel real rather than simply dramatic. Sasha died on her own terms for a purpose she had chosen. In a genre and a show where characters frequently die in ways they did not choose and did not see coming, that specificity matters. And then Shiva the Tiger arrives. The Kingdom forces, led by Ezekiel, charge through Alexandria's gates alongside hilltop fighters led by Maggie. The Saviors are driven back. Shiva tears into Saviors with a ferocity that the CGI team had clearly worked hard to make convincing. And while the digital work is uneven, the emotional impact of the scene is not. The crowd-pleasing nature of that cavalry arrival was something the season had genuinely earned. Season 7 had asked the audience to watch Rick fail for a long time, and the finale gave them the moment of relief that structure required. The Rotten Tomatoes critics' consensus specifically praised the tiger, which is not something you read very often. The episode's weaknesses are visible in the pacing of its first half and in the scavengers. The junkyard community led by Jadis had been introduced midway through Season 7 as a potential ally and betrayed Rick at the worst possible moment in this finale, which was meant to be a twist but had been telegraphed by the deliberately artificial quality of their characterization all season. Jadis and the Scavengers were widely criticised as one of the show's least effective additions, a creative choice that the show itself seemed to recognise, as they were quietly written out relatively quickly in Season 8. At an IMDb score of 7.8 and a Rotten Tomatoes critics score of 83%, this is a finale that is meaningfully better than the season preceding it. Sasha's exit is genuinely excellent. Shiva is Shiva. Number 7. Number 6. TS-19. Season 1, Episode 6. December 5th, 2010. The first season of The Walking Dead was 6 episodes long, and that constraint turned out to be a genuine structural gift. There was no padding. There were no episodes where the group had to be held in place, while the writers figured out what came next. 6 episodes to establish a world, develop a set of characters, and close a chapter. The discipline that imposed on the storytelling was visible in the result. TS19 aired on December 5th, 2010, and drew 5.97 million viewers, with another 2.1 million joining for the encore broadcast. For a basic cable drama at the time, those were significant and growing numbers, and AMC had already renewed the show for a second season before this episode went to air. The episode follows Rick's group arriving at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, where they find Dr. Edwin Jenner working alone in a facility that is slowly dying as its backup generators exhaust their fuel. He lets them in, gives them food and hot water and beds, and in doing so delivers something the first season had been building toward, a moment of brief, painful normalcy before the next loss. The next morning, Jenner shows the group test subject 19, a brain scan of his reanimated wife, the MRI sequence showing the infection spreading, and then the ancient brainstem reigniting is one of the most effectively disturbing pieces of horror storytelling the show ever produced, and it is disturbing precisely because of how clinical it is. There is no monster in the frame. There is a medical scan and a doctor's grief, and a very precise answer to a question the audience had been asking since the pilot. That sequence explains more about the nature of the Walking Dead world than almost anything in the seasons that followed. The episode's structural engine is the decontamination countdown, triggered when the last generator fails. The facility will self-destruct. Jenner has already decided to stay and die in it. Jackie makes the same choice and stays with him. Andrea nearly stays too, and it takes Dale refusing to leave the building without her, placing himself in front of her decision to change it. That is a real scene about grief and the choice to continue living, and it works. The episode's single most consequential moment is the quietest one. Before Rick runs for the exit, Jenna pulls him aside and whispers something in his ear. The show does not tell us what was said. We watch Rick's face change slightly, and then the moment passes. It is not revealed until the Season 2 finale that the whisper was this: everyone is already infected. Every person alive will reanimate upon death regardless of how they die, regardless of whether they were ever bitten. That single piece of information, delivered in a whisper in this episode, restructured the entire mythology of the show. It changed what the walkers meant. It changed what Rick's leadership obligations were. It changed the question at the heart of every loss that followed. The reception was mixed in ways that were interesting and specific. Comic readers objected to the CDC storyline on principle. None of it exists in the source material, and Robert Kirkman has since called it his biggest regret from the first season, saying it gave away information he had deliberately withheld in the comics to preserve a particular sense of mystery about the world. The creative friction around this storyline was reportedly significant in the circumstances surrounding Frank Darabont's departure as showrunner before Season 2 production began. Viewed on its own terms, as a television episode rather than as an adaptation, TS19 does precisely what a first season finale needs to. It delivers a contained, emotionally resonant chapter. It opens a door onto a much larger world, and it plants a piece of information so quietly that many viewers didn't fully understand its significance until 18 months later. It scored 8.7 on IMDb. It sits at number 6. Number 5. A Certain Doom, Season 10, Episode 16. October 4th, 2020. A Certain Doom has the most unusual production history of any finale in this show's run. It finished filming in November 2019. It was scheduled to air on April 12th, 2020. Then California shut down in March of that year, and all post-production work, the visual effects, the music mix, the sound design, the colour grading, Everything that needed facilities and people in the same room came to a halt. The episode sat, finished in terms of camera work but unfinishable in terms of craft, for nearly 6 months. It finally aired on October 4th, 2020, in a year when the idea of a world overrun by something invisible and lethal had taken on a texture that the show's writers had obviously not anticipated when they wrote it. For viewers who had watched episode 15, The Calm Before, which had revealed the Pike Massacre and was one of the most discussed episodes in the later seasons, the wait between those 2 episodes was nearly a full year. A season 10 premiere, 15 episodes of story, and then a 6-month gap before the conclusion. The Whisperer War closes in this episode. Alpha is already dead, killed by Negan in the penultimate episode of the season, and Beta has spent that episode becoming something beyond even his previous capacity for violence, more purely the role than the person, leading the Horde toward the community as a final act of devotion to a philosophy. His death comes from Daryl, 2 knives, both eyes standing in the middle of a sea of walkers. It is deliberately rendered without drama. No music swell, no speech. The camera does not linger. Beta had been constructed across 2 seasons as an almost inhuman embodiment of Whisperer ideology, and the show understood that the right ending for him was an efficient one. The Horde is redirected using speakers broadcasting music through the woods. Carol and Lydia lead the walkers to a cliff edge and send them over into the water below. Burning down the house by talking heads plays over the sequence. It is a specific and unusual musical choice, odd enough to feel intentional rather than arbitrary, and it works. The image of tens of thousands of walkers moving towards sound is one of the more visually interesting things the later seasons produced. The finale's emotional centre is Lauren Cohan, walking back into the show as Maggie Rhee for the first time since season 9. She had left the show in the episode that also depicted Rick's apparent death, and her absence across most of season 10 was one of several things that made that season's first half feel slightly incomplete. She arrives in the episode's final minutes, appearing in darkness at the rendezvous point, her face lit briefly by a torch. The show does not undersell or oversell the moment. She just arrives. For viewers who had waited 3 years for her return, the restraint was exactly right. Eugene's group ends the episode in the custody of heavily armed Commonwealth soldiers, a deliberately abrupt cliffhanger that set up the show's final arc, and the introduction of a new and very different kind of community. The COVID delay shaped how this episode was received at the time, in ways that were genuinely unfair to what the episode actually is. The momentum loss, the year-long gap in a season that had been building toward a specific emotional payoff, made the resolution feel smaller than it was. Coming back to it now with some distance from those circumstances. A Certain Doom is a solid and in places genuinely good season closer. It scored an 8.3 on IMDb and an 89% on Rotten Tomatoes. Angela Kang's season 10 as a whole earned strong critical notices, and this finale represents the later Walking Dead operating close to its ceiling. Number 5. Number 4. The Storm, Season 9, Episode 16. March 31st, 2019. Season 9 is The Walking Dead's quiet renaissance, and the story behind it is worth understanding before we talk about its finale. Angela Kang took over as showrunner after 8 seasons under 2 other people. Andrew Lincoln, who had been the centre of the show since its first scene, departed in episode 5. Lauren Cohan left in the same episode. What looked on paper like the conditions for a collapse produced instead the most critically acclaimed season since the early years of the show. Season 9 earned a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes, the highest critical score of any season in the entire run. The penultimate episode of that season, The Calm Before, earned a 9.4 on IMDb. It is the episode where the Pike Massacre is revealed, where the show puts the heads of named and beloved characters on spikes along a road, and Daryl reads their names aloud. It is a devastating piece of television, one of the best single episodes in the show's history. Following it with a season finale was always going to present a structural challenge. The Storm solved that challenge by deciding not to compete with it. This is the first time across 9 full seasons that the show depicted winter. The Walking Dead had always been a southern story, set in a perpetual Georgia summer that gave the world a specific quality, hot and humid and relentless, that suited its atmosphere. The arrival of winter in this episode changed everything visually. Walkers partially frozen in drifts, their movements slowed and strange. Characters moving carefully through conditions that were dangerous in a completely different way from anything the show had previously shown. A world the audience knew well, made genuinely unfamiliar. The communities are forced to cross whisperer territory because staying in place and attempting to wait out the storm would mean freezing. It creates a tense, quiet journey episode in which the threats come not primarily from other people or from fast-moving walkers, but from the cold itself and from the stiff, unpredictable dead embedded in the landscape. The episode's most discussed scene involves Negan and Judith Grimes. When Judith runs into the storm after Dog, Negan goes out after her. He carries her back through the blizzard to safety. Nobody sends him. Nobody is watching. He simply does it because she needed help. It is one of the cleanest pieces of character writing in the show's final seasons because it removes every possible cynical reading of his motivation. The redemption it suggests is not performed for anyone. It is just a man making a choice in a snowstorm when no one is looking. The scene works because it does not explain itself. The show has been carefully managing Negan's rehabilitation across an entire season, and this is the moment where it asks the audience to simply believe it, rather than debate it. Carol and Ezekiel's relationship begins to fracture here under the weight of Henry's death, a grief that has been carried quietly through the season's second half, and that the finale allows to surface. Carol's exit from the kingdom and the slow, precise dissolution of something that had felt stable is handled with the kind of restraint that characterises the best of Kang's episodes. The final scene shows a radio crackling to life at the hilltop, a voice from somewhere else cutting through the static, setting up the Commonwealth arc that would define the show's final 2 seasons. The Storm drew 5.02 million viewers and scored a 7.6 on IMDb, both of which reflect the continued audience erosion rather than the quality of the episode. Den of Geek gave it 4 stars and compared it favourably to Game of Thrones' tradition of quiet, reflective post-climax finales. The AV Club gave it a B and called it a meditation on grief. It is not a flashy finale, it is a careful one. And in a show that had spent too much of its middle period mistaking spectacle for meaning, that careful quality is worth more than it sounds. Number 4. Number 3. Beside the Dying Fire. Season 2, Episode 13. March 18th, 2012. Season 2 is a season that its own audience spent years arguing about. 13 episodes, large portions of which were set on Herschel's farm, while the group searched for a missing child, debated whether to keep a captive Woodbury man alive, and processed the events of the Season 1 finale in real time. The pace frustrated people. It frustrated a lot of people. Online discussions during the show's original broadcast were frequently impatient with the farm storyline in a way that has since softened somewhat, as the character work from that season has aged better than its reputation suggested it would. Beside the Dying Fire is the finale that made all of it worthwhile. It aired on March 18th, 2012, drawing 9 million viewers, with another 1.5 million joining for the encore broadcast the same night. The AV Club gave it an A-. The Huffington Post called it the best episode since the pilot. It scored a 9.2 on IMDb. The cold open is a piece of retroactive storytelling that works beautifully. A single gunshot, heard in Season 1, draws a cluster of walkers. A helicopter, glimpsed briefly in the pilot, pulls them north. A chain of sounds and movements spreading outward from Atlanta across the entire first and second seasons, quietly accumulating a herd of thousands without anyone in the show's world knowing it was happening. When that herd finally reaches Herschel's farm, the threat that destroys the group's home had been building since the first episode they ever watched. They just could not see it from where they were standing. When the herd comes, the episode does not slow down. Rick and Carl lure walkers into the barn and set it ablaze. The farm burns. Characters scatter in different vehicles in the darkness, trying to reach each other with no communication and no plan. Jimmy and Patricia, farm survivors who had been part of the cast for most of the season, are killed in the chaos without ceremony or extended farewell. The show understood that chaos looks like this. People die without anyone noticing until later. And then Andrea, separated from the others, and out of ammunition, and nearly out of strength, is running through the trees, and a hooded figure appears behind her attacker. 2 chained walkers on leashes, arms removed at the shoulder so they cannot bite. A katana. That is the entire introduction of Michonne. 15 seconds of screen time, no dialogue, no name, no explanation. It is one of the great character entrances in this genre, and it works because the episode has spent an hour at the edge of disaster before delivering this specific piece of relief. The group reconvenes on the highway where the second season had begun, and 2 of the episode's most important moments arrive in sequence. Rick reveals what Jenna whispered to him in the CDC building. Everyone is already infected. The people who have died and turned, the people they have killed who later reanimated, they were carrying the infection the entire time without knowing it. The world had always been this way. And then, when the exhausted and frightened group begins to question Rick's leadership, Rick delivers the speech. There is something specific and uncomfortable about that scene. Rick does not offer reassurance. He offers a choice: follow his leadership or leave. And he tells them that the group is no longer a democracy. It is the moment where the Rick Grimes of the first season, the careful and deliberate sheriff, trying to reason with an unreasonable world, steps back and allows something harder to step forward. The final image is Rick and Carl on a ridge at dawn, Rick with binoculars, a structure visible in the distance through the early light. The prison. A single shot that sets up the entire third season without a word of explanation. Worth noting, the episode's production history includes a near miss that changed the show's trajectory. Herschel Green was originally planned to die in this finale. The writers changed the decision because the death lacked emotional resonance in the context of the episode. That choice gave Scott Wilson 3 more seasons as one of the most quietly affecting presences in the entire cast. Beside the Dying Fire sits at number 3 because it did a very specific and very difficult thing. It redeemed a slow season, introduced one of the show's most important characters with one of the most efficient character entrances in the genre, and ended with the group in a fundamentally different moral and physical place than where they began. In 63 minutes. Number 2. A. Season 4, Episode 16. March 30th, 2014. There is a moment in A, the Season 4 finale, that viewers who watched it have not fully forgotten in the decades since. Rick Grimes on the ground in the dark, a man holding a knife to Carl's throat, does the only thing available to him. He bites out the man's jugular vein with his teeth, and when the threat is gone, he does not look horrified by what he just did. He looks like he would do it again without pausing to consider it. That moment is the entire thesis of Season 4 made into a single image. Rick Grimes had become something that could not be undone by simply returning to a quieter life, by growing crops, by teaching Carl to slow down. Season 4 had spent its first half building exactly that argument. Rick had stepped back from leadership. He had given the prison something like normalcy, with a council making decisions collectively, and Rick farming and keeping the peace. The flu outbreak that drives the season's first half had dismantled all of that methodically, right up to the governor's return and his final assault on the prison. After the prison falls in the mid-season finale, the season becomes a series of road episodes, each group of survivors moving alone toward a destination called Terminus that promises sanctuary. The show had been stripping away every layer of safety and institution and earned peace. And A is the episode where you see what is left underneath when all of those layers are gone. The episode intercuts present-day events with flashbacks to the prison, showing Herschel teaching Rick to farm and to be patient, and to think about what kind of world Carl was growing up into. Those flashbacks are devastating in context, not because they are sentimental, but because they show you clearly what Rick chose and what it cost him to make that choice work. And they arrive alongside scenes of him covered in a stranger's blood in a roadside ditch. Michelle MacLaren directed this episode. Her work on Breaking Bad had already established her as one of the best directors working in American television drama, and she brought that same visual discipline to A. She knows how to hold a frame until its meaning is settled completely, and she does it repeatedly here in ways that the show's direction in other seasons often fail to achieve. The Terminus sequence in the back half of the episode is constructed with a kind of slow, escalating dread that the show managed very well in its early years and struggled to replicate consistently later on. Rick spots Glenn's pocket watch on one of the Terminus residents. He spots riot gear that had belonged to the prison. His face changes and the audience reads the change, and then the episode confirms it. This is not a sanctuary. The compound is a trap. The group is herded at gunpoint through corridors past evidence of what Terminus actually does. Human remains, bones, names everywhere, carved by people who did not survive. They are pushed into a train car. The door closes. Inside they find Glenn, Maggie, Tara, Abraham, Rosita and Eugene already imprisoned. And then Rick speaks the line that the broadcast version softened and the Blu-ray restored, and the episode ends. The viewership was 15.68 million. The Terminus cliffhanger generated something that the show had not consistently produced in a while. Genuine, uncomplicated excitement for the season that was coming. Not apprehension, not dread, excitement. A scored a 9.2 on IMDb. IGN gave it an 8.0 and specifically praised the evolution of Rick's character across the season. It sits at number 2 because every element of it works. The direction, the writing, the character arc, the structure, the reveals, and the specific image of Rick biting a man's throat in the dark to protect his son, which is both deeply disturbing and completely earned by 4 seasons of cumulative storytelling. There's only one Walking Dead finale that sits above it. Number 1. Conquer. Season 5, Episode 16. March the 29th, 2015. 15.8 million viewers. That was the live audience for Conquer, the Season 5 finale, airing on March 29th, 2015. With DVR and delayed viewing counted in, that number climbed to 21.4 million. The highest rated cable season finale in television history at the time of its broadcast. The Reddit discussion thread after the episode generated nearly 7,000 comments and maintained a 94% upvote ratio. Variety called Season 5 arguably the show's best yet. The Guardian said the finale had everything a finale could want. The IMDb score for this episode is 9.3, the highest of any Walking Dead finale by a meaningful margin. All of that is true and worth noting. But the more interesting question, the one worth sitting with tonight, is why? What did this specific episode do that the show at its best was capable of, and that the show in its later years consistently struggled to replicate? The episode opens in the woods outside Alexandria with Morgan Jones, whose last substantial appearance in the show had been the Season 3 episode Clear, one of the finest hours in the series' run. Morgan had been broken then, grief and paranoia, and the death of his son having consumed him entirely. In this cold open, two Wolves operatives, men in scavenged clothing marked with wolf imagery, who will become a significant threat in Season 6, ambush him. Morgan defeats both of them with a wooden staff, with a calm efficiency that is the opposite of everything he was in, Clear. He places them both in a car and leaves them there. He does not kill them. The scene is the episode's first and most quiet statement of its central theme, and it is doing it through character action, rather than through dialogue. Morgan has found something in the years since Clear, a philosophy of restraint and non-violence that makes him the precise inverse of where Rick Grimes has arrived. The episode has announced its subject in its first 4 minutes, without a single line of exposition. The episode's structural engine is the Alexandria community meeting called to decide what to do about Rick, who had pulled a gun on Deanna's people in a public confrontation in the previous episode. The community is genuinely deciding whether to exile him. This is a real question, with a real answer that is not predetermined by the narrative architecture of the episode. Alexandria has its own values and its own history, and its own reasons for wanting to protect what it has built. Rick arriving and upending the community's sense of order is a legitimate concern that deserves a legitimate response, and the episode treats it as one. While the meeting is building toward its conclusion, Daryl and Aaron are trapped in a car dealership lot overrun with walker hordes, surrounded on all sides with no obvious exit. This is not a coincidental parallel. The episode is threading two things together. Rick's confrontation with the question of whether his way of surviving is compatible with a community that wants to be something other than survivors, and the proof that Alexandria needs people like Rick and Daryl, because the world outside its walls is still exactly as dangerous as Rick has been telling them. Morgan finds Daryl and Aaron. He's been following them to Alexandria using a map that Abraham left for Rick on the road in the Season 5 mid-season finale, an object that had been sitting in an episode 5 months earlier, quietly waiting to become important. When Abraham left that map, neither the characters nor the audience could have known what it would set in motion. Morgan found the note. He followed the map. He arrived at exactly the moment Daryl needed someone. This is the show at its best as a piece of long-form storytelling, an object planted in Episode 8 paying off in Episode 16, invisibly, without announcement. The meeting in Alexandria reaches its climax when Pete Anderson arrives drunk and enraged, carrying Michonne's confiscated katana. And in the struggle that follows, he slashes Reg Monroe's throat. Deanna's husband, bleeding out in her arms, dies while the community watches. And Deanna, through her grief, looks at Rick and tells him to do it. Rick executes Pete. And Morgan walks through the gate to see it happen. That image, Rick with a gun and a dead man, and Morgan arriving to witness it, is the most carefully constructed moment in the entire episode, and possibly in the entire season. The show does not editorialise it. Rick is not wrong to execute Pete. Pete was dangerous in ways that Alexandria was choosing not to acknowledge, and Deanna asked for it after watching her husband die. And Morgan's horror at the scene is not wrong either. A man he had known as a careful and deliberate person, a man whose survival and humanity had given Morgan a reason to keep going. When he found the note in King County, is standing over a body in a clean neighbourhood street. Both of these things are true at the same time. Rick is right, and what Rick is doing is genuinely troubling. The show does not resolve the tension between those positions, it simply holds them both. That is what Conquer does that the show in its later seasons struggle to do. It holds two genuinely opposed moral positions and refuses to tell you which one is correct. It trusts you to sit in the discomfort of not having an easy answer. For a show that had been accused across several seasons of sometimes simplifying its moral questions in the direction of whichever answer was more dramatically convenient, this was a return to what made the early seasons feel so much more alive than ordinary genre television. Greg Nicotero directed Conquer, and the episode contains what is arguably his finest single piece of visual direction in all of his Walking Dead work. Sasha Williams, in the episode's most quietly affecting subplot, has been struggling with survivor's guilt and grief throughout the season. She ends up in a graveyard outside Alexandria, and she lies down among the walkers she has killed and stares up at the sky. The camera holds on her face for a long time. She's not rescued. She's not in immediate danger. She's simply there in the space between living and not living, and the episode gives her room to occupy it. Gabriel Stokes has been spending the season trying to undermine Rick's group within Alexandria, driven by guilt and fear, and a faith that has been cracking at its foundation. In this episode, he accidentally leaves the gate open, creating a quiet secondary danger threading through the larger story. His resolution, Maggie finding him in the church mid-prayer as he breaks down in the rubble of his own convictions, is the episode's most unexpectedly moving scene. It is a scene about a character choosing whether to continue existing in the face of everything he has done and everything he has failed to do, and it earns its place in an episode full of much louder confrontations. Conquer sits at the top of this list because of what it understood about the show it was ending a chapter of. The Walking Dead was never, at its core, a show about zombies. The walkers are the weather, the permanent environmental condition that the story takes place inside. The show was always about what human beings do to each other when the systems that held them accountable have been removed. Rick executing Pete in a clean residential street in front of neighbours who came from a world where that was unthinkable, while a man who had found a reason to keep living through mercy watches from the gate is a precise and crystalline image of that question. There is no clean answer. The show knew there was no clean answer, and it made an episode that lived inside that understanding rather than trying to resolve it. 15.8 million people watched it live, 7,000 comments, the highest IMDb score of any Walking Dead finale by a meaningful margin. Conquer, Season 5, Episode 16, March 29th, 2015. The finest hour this show ever produced as a season finale, and the standard against which every other ending on this list is measured. Outro. And that is the complete ranking. Every Walking Dead season finale, from the one that did not make the cut, through 9 more endings ranging from frustrating to genuinely brilliant, all the way up to Conquer at the top. What these 11 finales show, when you lay them all out next to each other, is the arc of a show that spent its early seasons finding its footing, reached a period of genuine creative excellence between seasons 4 and 5, and then struggled for several years to rediscover the balance that made those episodes work as well as they did. Angela Kang's stewardship of seasons 9 through 11 brought the show's critical standing back up considerably. The audience numbers never fully recovered, partly because of the structural changes in how people watch television, and partly because the trust that the Season 6 cliffhanger broke was real and took time to rebuild. And by the time the show had done the work to rebuild it, the habits of the audience had already changed. If your own ranking looks different from this one, the comments are a good place for it. There are genuinely strong arguments for putting Beside the Dying Fire at the top of this list. And there are people who feel that A belongs at number 1 based on the Rick character arc alone. These conversations have been running for over a decade, and they have not become less interesting with time. There is a great deal more to cover in the Walking Dead universe. The spin-offs that the series finale was quietly previewing in its final minutes each have their own stories to tell, and we will get to all of them. For now, that is enough for tonight.